This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm zooming today, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hello, my name is Tim Lynch. I'm delighted to welcome you all to another Great Books delivered online. We're now into lockdown 2.0, level 4, and we will keep offering it in this format until we can all rejoin in a physical space, which I hope is very soon. It's my great delight to welcome a new speaker to our series. Professor Margaret Cameron is the first ever female professor of philosophy at the University of Melbourne. She was born in Canada, educated at the University of Toronto. She began as a student of gender studies before moving to English literature and then to philosophy. Her light bulb moment, her conversion to philosophy came in a chance encounter with Bertrand Russell's A History of Western Philosophy, a text that both inspired her and also provided a foil for her analysis and thinking across the span of her career. After holding positions at the City of New York's Hunter College in Manhattan, and then Cambridge University, Margaret moved back to Canada to take up a research chair in the Aristotelian tradition at the University of Victoria on beautiful Vancouver Island. She's also expanded her research profile, which is primarily focused on the 12th century Peter Abelard, he of Abelard and Eloise fame, to contemporary metaphysics, aesthetics, and the history of early modern philosophy. She's currently focusing on an entirely new area of research, the ethics and politics of the true crime genre, which she tells me in truth is just so she can justify reading true crime narratives for research purposes. It is my great delight to welcome Margaret to 10 Great Books and for this month's Great Book. Thank you.
The first words of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics are the following: every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good. This is a bold statement. Some have taken it to be true, but many others have thought it presents a fallacy. These words introduce the ethics written by Aristotle in the 4th century BCE and have been read by thousands upon thousands of people. This book formed an important part of the curriculum of study in universities for hundreds of years, and has produced an ethical framework that has been adopted by monotheistic religions and many other people around the world. Great philosophers such as Averroes or Ibn Rushd and St. Thomas Aquinas have commented on this work in detail in a way that reflects their particularly medieval interpretation of this ancient material. And many modern thinkers are still adapting it anew to fit our contemporary lives. Aristotle's ethics is driven by one important question: what does it mean to lead a good life? What is the good life for a human being? When writing this book, Aristotle was primarily thinking about the good life for freeborn men in Athens, but we'll return to that issue later. I'll refer more broadly to human beings throughout, since everything he applies equally well to all genders. So imagine asking your friends and family what they thought would be a good life. We all have some friends who are just driven by money. They went to school and university in order to get a good job, in order to earn a good living, so that they could pay for their families and pass wealth on to their children. Others are driven by the pursuit of honors and fame. Think of politicians who get into the game for the honor it bestows, or footballers or actors who, while they undoubtedly enjoy their game or their craft, sometimes only do it because they think it will make them famous. And then there are others who just want to lead a life of pleasure. They enjoy taking it easy at work and avoiding challenges and attempts to be saddled by greater responsibilities. They want to enjoy the company of their friends and their families and take it easy on the weekend, and generally do what they can do to avoid boredom, which is a kind of pain. These are all the common goals and aims in people's lives. However, what Aristotle asks each of these sorts of people is this: what do you want the money for? What do you want the fame for? And for what purpose are you pursuing a life of pleasure? Isn't there something beyond these goals, something common to all human beings that drives our decisions and our actions in life? Moreover, if you lead a life in pursuit of wealth and wealth alone, and this is taken away from you by a financial crisis or theft, what are you left with? Similarly with fame, in today's media age, we have seen famous people's reputations destroyed within hours, never to be recovered again. And it goes without saying that a life dedicated to only enjoying the pleasant things is the most vulnerable of all. Pain in life is all too common and can be brought about so easily. So what we should pursue in life, therefore, should have two basic characteristics. First, it must be complete. What we aim for must not be something that once acquired leaves us thinking, what's next? What more is there to be had in life? As Aristotle says, we call complete without qualification that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. Second, it should be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency is, and these are Aristotle's words, that which when isolated makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. This is something we should be giving a lot of thought to today. There's one thing that fits both criteria according to Aristotle, and this is happiness. He says, happiness then is something complete and self-sufficient, and is the end of action. By end of action, he means it's the ultimate goal or the purpose of everything that we do. Of course, there would be lots of intervening steps along the way. We deliberate about these steps all the time. If I do this, then I can get this. If I can be this way, then I will do this, and so forth. We can deliberate about the means, but we do not deliberate about the goal or the purpose of life. And this, for Aristotle, is happiness. This seems on the surface of things both right, but also a little superficial. People are all different and they have different values and different aspirations. So how can there be one ultimate goal, one good for everyone? Aristotle was aware of this type of question, and so he wondered whether it would help if we knew the function of human beings. By function, he meant their characteristic activity, the thing about human beings that distinguishes them from every other type of species or thing in the world. So consider a flute player or a sculptor or any other type of artist or artisan. Each has a function or a characteristic activity, and it's in this activity that the good or well-being of them is located. So the function of the flute player is to play the flute. The function of the good flute player is to play the flute well. So quite obviously, parts of humans and parts of animals also have characteristic activities or functions. There's a peculiar and specific function had by the eyes, which is to see, the ears, which is to hear, our hands, thumbs, livers, hearts, and so on. But do human beings as a species have a function? Does an individual human, qua human, and not as a flute player or a lawyer, etc., have a function? Yes, the proper activity of human beings, according to Aristotle, is this. Now, if the function of a man is an activity of the soul in accordance with the rational principle, if this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of soul in conformity with excellence. And if there are more than one excellence, in conformity with the best and the most complete. The function of human beings is to reason. This is the characteristic feature that distinguishes us as a species from all other worldly things. Aristotle then adds a caveat. But we must add, he says, in a complete life. For one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day. And so too one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on this word happy. This is a translation of the Greek term eudaimonia, which means more or less good-souled. So this is not the modern sense of the word happy when we ask questions such as, are you happy today? Or do these shoes or do these puppies make you feel happy? Happiness in Aristotle's sense is not a feeling. It's an activity of the soul when it has accomplished certain goals. Once it's acquired, it can't be taken away. I prefer not to use the word happy because of the connotations of a fleeting or a temporary psychological feeling. I think it's better to think of eudaimonia in terms of flourishing. So think of the condition of a healthy and flourishing plant. This plant is living well and faring well. That's the sense of happiness that Aristotle has in mind. We should also pause over this word soul, which has been overlaid with medieval and contemporary connotations. The word soul translates the ancient Greek word pneuma, which is properly translated as breath. The soul is quite simply that which gives life to things. Living humans have souls, as do living animals such as dogs, cats, horses, and even centipedes. Any living thing has a soul. So for Aristotle, even living plants are ensouled. Compare the case of carrots in the supermarket versus carrots growing in the ground. The former, the carrots in the supermarket, are not properly speaking carrots because they've lost their souls, their principle of life, and therefore they can no longer thrive or flourish as carrots. Only living things have, by definition, souls. Another important point to note, the flourishing life, according to Aristotle, should be a pleasant life. It should feel pleasurable to be living well and faring well. Now, we shouldn't seek to live a happy life because it gives us pleasure. That would make pleasure the highest human good. Rather, a feeling of pleasure should attend or ride on top of a flourishing life. Another way to put this point is that it should not hurt to be happy. In fact, Aristotle recommends that we use these supervenient pains and pleasures that attend our decisions and actions as a moral guide. He says, moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It's on account of the pleasure that we do bad things, and it's on account of pain that we abstain from noble ones. Hence, he says, we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought. For this is the right education. Plato was, of course, Aristotle's teacher. I'll return to the point about the right education later, but for now, note the important point about the value of having the right sorts of pains and pleasures. This is part of our moral fabric, and we need to be educated to feel things rightly. We cannot achieve happiness, though, by sheer force of will or some sort of mental control. We live in a complex world that extends beyond the walls of our internal lives. Sure, there's plenty to be found within our inner mental lives, our thoughts, our desires, the rich range of emotions, memories, worries, and so on. But we also need certain things in the external world in order to be morally fulfilled. Look at what Aristotle says on this point. Evidently, happiness needs the external goods as well, for it's impossible or not easy to do noble acts without the proper equipment. In many actions, we use friends and riches and political power as instruments. And there are some things the lack of which takes the luster from blessedness, such as good birth, satisfactory children, and beauty. For the man, he says, who is very ugly in appearance, or ill-born and solitary and childless, is hardly happy. And perhaps a man would be still less so if he had thoroughly bad children or friends, and had lost good children or friends by death. This is a really striking set of claims. One question we need to ask ourselves is whether this list of things that might prevent a person from being happy, such as being childless or having terrible children, is actually true. Well, if we consider the parent of a murderer or a tyrant, this seems to bear some truth. One can imagine that their lives would be shattered and that genuine happiness would be elusive in that case. But we know of many childless people whose lives are no less successful than those with children. So I'll put this point aside for now, and perhaps we can take it up in the question and answer period. The question is this: how do we acquire happiness for ourselves? We're not born happy, according to Aristotle, although humans are born with the potential for happiness. How then do we activate or actualize our inborn potential for happiness? It doesn't come about by chance, and it's not divinely given. We do so by cultivating the right sorts of habit. Becoming a moral being is an exercise in habituation, and the activities we choose to engage in determine the character of our lives. What we're seeking is to engage the soul in activities that result in a happy life that is immune from unhappiness despite misfortune. It's a condition of the soul that can't be removed even with the loss of other goods in life, such as money or family, friends, a job, and so on. Although if someone lost all those things, it would not really be possible to exercise the soul in such a way as to be happy. Aristotle is a far cry away from the Stoics, who believed it was possible for a man to be happy even when being tortured on the rack, as they said. So let's return to Aristotle's point about the characteristic activity or function of human beings, which is to use our reason. For Aristotle, for us, Aristotle and most other philosophers have thought it was the capacity to use reason that sets us apart. The right use of reason is what should organize a human being's life so that they can thrive. Just consider how deeply ingrained this philosophical idea is within cultures around the world. We commonly call a slovenly person a pig, or a cheating husband a dog. We label comatose patients as being vegetative, indicating the absence of active reason. All of these animal and vegetative epithets are meant to indicate that despite continuing to be people, some have lost their proper status as fully human. This is not a prescription for becoming like Spock on Star Trek or being analytically robotic. On the contrary, Aristotle acknowledges that we have and we will always continue to have a deep and meaningful emotional life. We will always have needs and wants, desires and appetites. We need to meet the basic demands of our bodies, and we will always be intertwined in the vast world of politics, finance, other people, and things. In order to be happy, what we need to do, according to Aristotle, is to learn to interact with these things in an excellent way, which is just in a virtuous way. What are these things? Our emotions, our appetites and desires, political and social structures, other people, the world of commerce. We need to do so in a way that allows us as human beings to be both complete and self-sufficient. This is not desert island ethics. This is a guide for learning how to become a flourishing human being in a complex and messy world. The rest of Aristotle's ethics is all about this. It's dedicated to identifying ways of interacting with our own minds and with the external world. What Aristotle identifies are the various ways our human souls can be excellent with respect to these things. These excellences are what Aristotle calls virtues. In what follows, I'm going to focus on the moral virtues, and I'll leave aside another set of virtues which Aristotle took to be very important, which are our intellectual virtues. But I'll focus on the moral virtues which are acquired by habituating ourselves with regard to our emotions, desires, and things in the external world. It's very important to recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all formula that can be used by everyone in the same way. Take, for example, the virtue of courage. Think of something that you've gone through in your life when you've said to yourself, I'm just not brave enough to do that, or I don't think I have enough emotional strength for that. Perhaps it was getting up on stage to perform in a talent show, or perhaps it was asking someone out on a date, or asking for a raise at your job when you believed you deserved it. Or in a more extreme situation, perhaps you felt that you lacked the courage to stand up to a bully or an aggressor. What would it mean to have the right amount of courage, right? The right amount to deal with these situations as you wished? There's no single amount of courage that's going to be appropriate for everyone in these scenarios. Courage, like a dose of medicine or an amount of food, is relative to the condition and experience of each individual person. So just as you would not administer an adult-sized dosage of painkillers to a baby, you probably also wouldn't consume the same number of calories in a day that someone training to be an Olympic athlete would. But there is a right amount of medicine that suits a baby, and there is a right caloric intake for your body mass and for your fitness lifestyle. So too, at different stages in your life, there's an appropriate amount of courage for you to display. Let's consider the case of stage fright. If you've been practicing a new musical instrument for just, say, 6 months, it would be terribly frightening to think of going on stage to perform in front of hundreds of people. The pain that this prospect raises in you, pain in the form of fear or worries about being embarrassed, is a guide to the appropriate moral behavior you should exhibit. It tells you that you need to start smaller, given your experience and your current conditioning. You would probably at that point be considered brave just to perform in front of your family and a few close friends. The same is true for bigger and more dramatic acts of courage. So courage, as a virtue, is a mean relative to two extremes, namely fear and overconfidence. So in the case of stage or performance anxiety in the previous example, that person's desire to go on stage while being too inexperienced gave rise to fear. And had they actually gone on stage to perform, they would have been, morally speaking, or relative to their character, unvirtuous. But let's see the other extreme that anchors the scale of bravery, namely overconfidence or rashness. Imagine an inexperienced pilot decides he wants to fly a long and very dangerous mission to go rescue someone stranded in a remote location. Perhaps from playing too many video games or due to a lack of self-awareness, this pilot nonetheless decides to take the trip. Here too, the pilot would lack virtue with regard to this decision and this action. Even if the trip were a success, Aristotle would consider that a lucky one-off. For exhibiting virtue is something that must be done consistently. Once a virtue is truly acquired, it cannot be lost. So let's look at this chart. Aristotle locates the virtues at the mean between relative extremes. Here are a few examples. So I've organized the examples in terms of the objects to which those virtues are to be directed. So let's take the first, because we've used this example already. The object in our life is fear. With regard to fear, fearsome things, we need to find ways to exhibit courage. Going too far in one direction will result in simply in fear itself, but at the other extreme, we have recklessness, which we want to avoid. The mean is somewhere between those two extremes, and there's going to be a right point on that scale for you. Take the objects of food, drink, sex, and other goods. We want to lead a temperate life. We don't want to lead a life of overindulgence in all of these things, nor do we want to lead a life of abstinence with regard to these things. Rather, we need to find the point of temperance that works for us with regard to our habits with food, drink, sex, and so forth. Things that are valued by money. These things are everywhere in our lives, and we need to cultivate the virtue of liberality and avoid the extremes of being frugal or overindulgent. And we can even expand this up on to large scale worth, where we can think of the virtue of magnificence, right? That could be exhibited by people with great sums of money, or perhaps governments. Similarly, with honor and anger, there are the virtues of pride and good temper, and there are many others. As you can see, being good-tempered is considered a virtue. This is a really interesting point to think about our soul being in a condition such that we are in a good mood, we might say, that we feel a good-tempered sensibility. But we all know that it's impossible to be good-tempered all the time. And there are even some times when it would be inappropriate to be good-tempered. Aristotle recognized this fact. Being good-tempered, of course, helps society get along, and it helps keep pacific relations in the workplace and in the household. But just as there are occasions when it's morally wrong or morally vicious to exhibit an explosion of anger, so say somebody accidentally steps on your foot, or when someone asks you to wear a mask during a global pandemic, there are also occasions when it's right, when it's morally justifiable to get angry and to show it. This virtue Aristotle called righteous indignation. If someone insults your children without reason, or if your partner has a secret love affair that you find out about, it would not be morally defensible for you simply to shrug your shoulders and get on with things. It's wrong, it's morally wrong to let people walk all over us. The morally defensible thing to do is to be angry, to be righteously indignant. Some other examples of virtues and vices and the respective objects, facts, manners, other people, and even ourselves. There's a virtue with regard to how we behave towards ourselves, avoiding the vice of extreme shyness and the opposite vice of shamelessness. There is another important virtue, which is the virtue of justice, which applies on the civic scale, but we don't have time to get into that rich and very influential discussion today. So how do we acquire these virtues? Being able to act from a firm and unchanging character, to choose the right decision or action towards the right people or things at the right time for the right reasons for you, in the condition that you're in, and with the right experiences under your belt, this all seems rather daunting. Aristotle's answer is this: you should always do, or you should always aim to do, what the virtuous person would do. If that sounds a bit unhelpful to you, consider a very similar human experience. Think of the experience of becoming a musician, say a violinist. When you first pick up the instrument and the sheet music, you're not a violinist. You have the potential to be a violinist, but this potential has yet to be activated. Whether consciously or not, all the steps you will take towards becoming a violinist will be determined by what an already proficient violinist would do. You learn to read sheet music because that's what a violinist does. You find a teacher because that's what a violinist does. You practice and you practice and you practice. At first you sound nothing like a violinist as you squeak and scratch out some sounds, but you know what good violin playing looks like and you know what it sounds like. You know, theoretically at least, what the violinist does. Each day as you practice, trying to do your best at what the violinist does, you become eventually a violinist. The idea is the same in the realm of becoming a morally virtuous person. Like learning the violin or learning to speak an additional language, you're not going to get it right on the first or second, or perhaps even the 10th try. In the realm of ethics, you're practicing towards virtue. You're doing what virtuous people do until one day you yourself are virtuous. Like learning the violin or a second language, it obviously helps your chances of success if you start very early in life. So too for practicing courage, friendliness, justice, and liberality. We all know people in life who didn't practice when they were young, and now it seems for them that it's too late. A happy life is not possible for some people. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So how should we think about the relevance and the value of the lessons contained in Aristotle's ethics today? Aristotle, after all, didn't actually even defend the views that he wrote in this text. He assumed, as did many other philosophers in the ancient world, that ethical striving is simply part of our nature. Aristotle did not take this point as requiring any special defense. It is, as it were, a kind of biological fact about human beings. He also took it for granted that acquiring virtues was an inherently valuable exercise, and it was not to be accomplished instrumentally, not to be accomplished in order to achieve other things. Acquiring the virtues would simply result in happiness. This assumption has been criticized by some later thinkers as what they call the guise of the good, namely the idea that all of our actions, as the first words of this book state, aim at some good. The focus of Aristotle's text on the life of a single individual's moral development has also been met with criticism that this is not really ethics at all. Ethics, at least in its contemporary form, has more to do with questions such as, what do we owe one another? Or what's the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Aristotle's so-called ethics, then, appears to be an exercise in sheer egoism. What Aristotle seems to be offering us is a self-help guide, not a book of morality. As it's been pointed out, moreover, Aristotle wrote this text thinking primarily, if not exclusively, about free men in a financially stable environment. Right? Think of the virtue of magnificence making it onto the list, right off the start. He also thought of them as living in a relatively free and politically stable context. This might entail that a happy life on Aristotle's terms is just not possible for many people in the world. It seems to require basic political stability for justice to be possible, for example. It requires family and social networks that are dependable over time. It also requires a certain amount of material prosperity to afford the time and the energy to practice towards virtue. If you're living in poverty and are constantly afraid that you won't find your next meal, or if you live a life of violence and are dominated by fear as a result, it may seem as if these virtues are simply unattainable. More importantly, if you live in a household or a neighborhood or a region where there are few to no examples of virtuous people, the chances of living a virtuous life may seem to be beyond grasp. Many people, after all, grow up without ever seeing or hearing a talented violinist. These are all fair points. And perhaps at the extreme outer limits, growing up in abject poverty or caught in the crosshairs of a long-standing violent political feud, for example, perhaps at these limits, attaining the virtues that will result in a flourishing life may be very difficult to achieve. But there's an important sense in which these criticisms serve to enforce Aristotle's very point. Being the sorts of creatures that we are, there are certain bare minimums needed in order for us even to have a chance of flourishing. Contemporary philosophers, such as Martha Nussbaum, have developed this idea into a political theory that puts capabilities at the forefront. So rooted in this theory of Aristotle's, instead of asking, as other political theorists and politicians do, say how we might redistribute goods and wealth to people in order for them to lead a good life, a capabilities approach asks a different question. It asks, how can we ensure that basic human capabilities, our capacity to have friends, to be good with resources, to enact justice, how can we ensure that these be allowed to flourish? There are countless other things to say about this masterful book, and it's been read by heaps of people and was studied, as I mentioned at the outset, by every university student until the modern era. You can find thousands of academic commentaries on it, not to mention loads of scholarly articles and monographs. And recently, there has been a significant resurgence of virtue ethics discussions and debates in academia. And why not? We still all ask ourselves the fundamental question that guides Aristotle in this book. What does it mean to live a good life? At this time of global pandemic, when we have been stuck in our homes for the better part of 2020 and are looking towards a future filled with pretty serious financial insecurity, challenges to the way we conduct ourselves in public, in schools, in the workplace, and the ongoing fear that we will be faced with a new infectious reality, the question about what constitutes the good life is even more pressing. Many people have recently been finding ways to cope without access to the many resources we've come to depend upon and indeed to take for granted. People have lost jobs and income, and they cannot afford to live in the way they were accustomed. Technology has allowed us to enjoy an occasional Zoom cocktail or book club meeting with friends such as this, but as we all say to one another, it's really just not the same. Aristotle had a lot to say about the virtue of friendship. He classified the different types of friendships, ones with which we're all familiar. There are friendships of utility, friendships that are fleeting, friendships between and equals friendships with our own family members. I'll leave off with one final quotation from Aristotle about the nature of friendship and this specific virtue at a time of global pandemic. Aristotle is, in this case, thinking about a person who actually has achieved all of the virtues in their life after long practice and reflection. He's thinking about a person then who could be considered truly happy. And he asks, would a genuinely happy person even need friends? His answer, which is timely for us at this moment in world history as we sit separately in our own homes, is this: do we need friends more in good fortune or in bad? They are sought after in both. For while men in adversity need help, in prosperity, they need people to live with and to make the objects of their beneficence. For they wish to do well by others. Friendship then is more necessary in bad fortune, but it's more noble in good fortune. For the very presence of friends is pleasant both in good fortune and in bad, since grief is lightened with friends' sorrow with us. Hence, one might ask whether they share it as it were our burden, or without that happening, their presence by its pleasantness, and the thought of their grieving with us makes our pain less. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Margaret. That was a terrific dissection of one of the most important thinkers that we have, Aristotle. What I thought you did remarkably well is offer some everyday examples of some very complex thinking that have puzzled people over several millennia. I'm sure the audience will have lots of questions and comments in regards to your particular approach, but you asked some of the biggest questions. What is the good life? Why is happiness so important? And importantly, I think you've raised some difficult questions about how we think about life, the good life, what happiness is in a moment of global pandemic. And I'm sure this will lead to a terrific exchange when we argue through these issues at the live session. So Margaret, thank you very much for now. And I would encourage all our Great Books members to come to our live session on August the 18th, Tuesday, August the 18th at 6:30, when we can unpack and argue about some of these very important claims made by this very great philosopher. Margaret, thank you very much, and we will see you all soon.